facing the wall. He kept the attic key on a loop of twine, because metal seemed rude in a house mostly made of wood. The duplex on Rindle Street was the kind that sat a little back from the row, like it had stepped aside for an argument that never ended. The landlord, Mrs. Kemper, had said there was storage space up there if he kept the hatch closed and didn't drag anything sharp on the joists. "No one's gone up in a long time," she'd added, like an apology to the dust. Evan had never been a man who thought an attic bothered the living. He'd grown up with a crawl space over the hallway where his mother kept the tree stand and a bag of clothes nobody would ever wear again. In that house, the attic hatch had no lock. It bowed to seasons. You could hear it exhale when July made the tar soft on the roof. In Rindle Street's stairwell, the hatch sat flush, painted several times a shade near cream that read as the absence of decision. Somebody had screwed a jar ring onto it years ago. When he tugged, splinters pushed under his thumbnail. The ladder, thin and aluminum, folded out with a complaint. The attic smell had traveled down into the ceiling between his living room and his bed for as long as he had the key and not used it. The dry smell of needled wood, the slightly sweet stale that old paper chooses when it accepts its only task is to exist. When the bulb came on, the long filament inside sang without meaning to. He climbed the last rung and put both hands out to take the sloping away of the roof into his arms so he would not strike his head. The weak light drew corners that had been thinking in private. A trunk sat in the middle on boards laid across joists. Someone had made a platform with care. The boards sat slightly out of true, the way an apology sits just a hair off genuine. Brittle papers ruffled when he moved. Sweaters slumped like they'd remembered shoulders and then forgotten. Between the trunk and the nearest bundle of newsprint, stamped with dates from years before his birth, but bound with twine like bread, the little face caught a ran of light and did that trick old glaze does when it remains a skin even after yellow has gone. Porcelain cracked with the small maps age makes. A hairline had run across one cheek and disappeared in the yarn hair, which had been orange once and was now the color of a parking cone that spent 2 winters in the sun. The lace of her dress had stained in a ring where something wet had been and then had not. One eye had been painted the astonishing blue that made cheap dolls look more expensive, and a chip had taken most of it away. The other eye was blank white, the intended base. Her mouth was the thin painted lip a person had thought modest looked like in a workshop under a humming fixture. He hadn't meant to pick her up. He had gone up for a space heater he'd left after the move, and for a cardboard box he had marked chords in the way people mark boxes when they can think of a gentler word. His hand went out because small things invite them. Her weight registered inside his palm the way a wrench does. The promise of density that tile has when you lift it. The lace scraped his thumb. He had the small, monstrous thought that someone had dressed her for a day he had missed and he was late coming to collect. He told himself quiet and untrue sentences. This is only a piece of the past. Someone has left this here to forget. He pressed his mouth together because even moving other people says things can feel like theft if the thing has a pretend face. He carried her down the ladder, the bulb buzzing behind him, the attic air thinking its own place back into place. The stairwell had that plain old house smell, varnish and a ghost of old cooking oil. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed at the pitch he had learned when the compressor was content. It would complain later, on and off, a little click like a metronome with arthritis. He set her on his nightstand facing the wall because he had to start with something. Facing the door felt presumptuous. Facing the bed felt unkind. The wall had taken nails in other people's arrangements. 3 spots showed the pale outlines of rectangles where something had been. He always noticed where a person's life had hung and what it left behind. He washed his hands with dish soap because there was dirt under one nail and because old paper leaves behind a taste you cannot banish. The towels on his oven handle had crisp edges because he folded them the way his mother had taught him at 12. A flat fold that tucked the fabric into itself in thirds so air could walk through and finish what the dryer didn't at tea. He made a mug of tea in the heavy cup he liked best, the one that turned its chip toward his lip on nights he let loneliness and heat meet him. He watched the steam, because watching steam is a clean thing you can give your eyes when the world is a cluttered table. He worked nights at the distribution center on the edge of town. The building had been a cannery when his mother was young. Now it took boxes from trucks and sent them to other trucks. A scanner hung from his belt. He liked its weight. The beeps, pitched just wrong, arranged themselves into the song of a job. On good nights, the vacuum palletizer did not oversell its suction, and he didn't have to slap boxes to make them believe in a new arrangement. On bad nights, the fluorescent lights along aisle D buzzed in disharmony that made him feel he had chosen violence by keeping his eyes open. On the way to work, he watched the traffic lights on Hollow Pike keep the promises they had kept since he had a license. Green stayed green the right length of time to make him forget the world had changed under him. Yellow hung just enough to make you feel you had been treated kindly. Red was red. Every once in a while, in winter especially, the wind took the cables and made the whole array tremble in sympathy with a truck passing. Tonight, the wind had started a small argument at the corner where a barber pole leaned under a picture of a haircut no one had. The lights decided to vibrate a little and then remembered themselves. He checked in. The clock punched with a plastic thunk into a record he loved, because there is not much left that leaves a mark on paper for plainness' sake. He wore the canvas jacket with the soft lining, patched at the cuff. He liked inventories that didn't change. He liked shelves that stayed their height. He moved boxes from one path to another like a person who knows a town and traffic routes. Between the scanner beeps, the far-off chirp of a pallet jack-backing and the distant compressor coming on behind the refrigerated section made the building feel like a creature that had learned to sleep with its eyes open. Near 3 in the morning, his stomach reminded him he had allowed it only crackers and coffee. The break room had one window no one ever looked through because it saw only the back wall where trucks kissed seals. The microwave had a button with no label left and it beeped at the wrong pitch. He ate the sandwich he packed at 11 with too much mustard because mustard reassures bread that it will be a meal, not an apology. He folded the wax paper and put it into a bag because leaving food on a table felt like leaving a sentence unfinished. The coffee machine sighed. You could see the steel legs of a man on the loading dock adjust, and Evan's body replica adjusted, the way a person mirrors without meaning to. He checked his phone out of habit. No messages. That was the ordinary piece of his life now. No messages meant no crisis. By 4:30, most noise had softened. The forklift on the far aisle made a backwards cheep and then stopped as if it had changed its mind. The building changed its breath. He thought of his kitchen, the mug on the sink, the towel folded properly, the refrigerator humming at a pitch you could adjust your own breathing to if you had that kind of mind. He always imagined the apartment while he worked, how it would receive him, the unchanged scale of it, the faithful inanimate. It used to be a person he thought of then. Now it was a refrigerator, a towel, a nightstand with a glass of water on it. When he turned into the drive at 5:15, the traffic light at the bottom of Rindle Street hung too long on yellow, and then, with an embarrassed blink, went red for no one. He waited until habit let him continue. His body noticed the difference and pretended not to. He set his keys in the dish by the door because he had inherited the dish with the apartment, and it felt wrong to cheat its purpose. The fridge hummed. He took his jacket off and hung it on the chair because the coat hooks by the door leaned, and you only ask a leaning hook to bear so much. He finished the last of his water and made a ring on the counter he wiped with the corner of a towel. The towel smelled like dryer and a faint iron tang left over from the building's pipes. He walked to the bedroom. turned the light on softly with his knuckle to save the switch's pride, and looked at the nightstand. The space where the doll should have been was only wall. The spot had held shadow earlier when he'd set her there, and the shadow had been shaped by a yarn head and a flaring edge of lace. Now the wall returned his light only as wall. He looked at the floor, not because he believed in accidents, but because the mind demands the ordinary sequence first. The floor under the nightstand held the dust that accumulates when a person does not move furniture every week with zeal. No doll. The bed had the rumples of a man who had gotten in and out with his socks on and then had made the bed badly. At the foot of the bed, more rumple, not his. He didn't see her at first. He felt the cold wreath first, the absence of sound that isn't silence exactly, more like someone has put a blanket over the room's heart and rubbed in place. His eyes began to negotiate with the dark and found the chipped curve of an eye catching the thin, bright theft of a moon through a gap in the shade. She sat at the foot of the bed, her stiff legs dangling a hair's breadth above the floor because the mattress was high. One yarn hank had been caught under her shoulder. The chipped eye saved a line of light and made it a cold thing. He had a stupid thought, that she had turned to see what the refrigerator had to say. It was late enough that even city sounds had learned to be far. The distant siren was lying down with its face in its hands. The traffic light's faint shift did not reach the room. He heard the old building sigh aboard into a new position. He heard his own swallow, and then he heard a sound that took a half-second to teach him. A faint tapping sound, light as a fingernail when you drag it on fabric to warn a child to wake. Porcelain foot on blanket. A click, small and anti-theatrical. He put his hand out, not toward her, toward the lamp. The switch took 3 tries because his fingers had decided their own song. Light changed the room into a place. She looked no different. That was the worst part. She didn't sprout a new limb or grin. She sat with her head tipped the degree that says, attention. Her lace had caught on a pill of the blanket and made a small tent. The blue crescent eye saved what light it was owed. The other eye, to his surprise, had a gleam, but that was the paint. Glaze remembers how to throw back, no matter what color rests on it. He exhaled, and it sounded like someone letting air out of a tire in slow kindness. He stood and picked her up because picking up is what a person does in a room where a thing has gone where it shouldn't tea. Her shoulders gave a little, thread complaining as his hand closed under her arm, the way the old complain without the wish to be heard. He set her on the nightstand facing the wall. He put his hand on her head and took it away because he was not that person. And then he put it back because some part of the day needed to be completed with a touch. He slept with the light on. He has been ashamed of that since he was 13, and the sound of mice in a wall had taught him what the mind will do to protect itself. At 8 the next morning, the fridge came on with its regular voice, and he sat up and felt the sting in his shoulder that says you slept in an angle. The doll sat where he had put her. Light showed dust on the top of the shade. He wanted to say her name out loud and had no name for her. He's not a man who names things easily. He went about the day in obedience to the first day's list. He showered in water that smelled a little like pennies. He dried with a towel big enough to hide in because growing up he had been given small towels and had made his case for big towels and lost. And now he had decided never to lose again in this one small arena. He made eggs and burned one and stood at the sink until the pan told him it was ready to be wiped. He left the house because leaving the house makes rooms behave. The interstate near the distribution center sang its road song as if no one had slept poorly. He clocked in at 3 for the early night because a delivery needed hands and because he liked the night better when he had asked it to come. The beeps of the scanner felt like a choir he had finally joined that sang the note he could sing. He met Jules in the aisle, where the lighting made everyone look like an apology, and they said 2 things to each other that meant more than they let them mean. The compressor behind the cold room clicked on and off, quickly at 7, more slowly later. The printer at the manager's desk printed a long thing with no ink in it. The radio, the dockman keeps low under his chair, said words about a water main near the center of town, cracking open a road like an egg, and the city, this city, and then the next county, SS2, asking people to boil out of an abundance. "Don't brush your teeth with the tap," the voice said. "Don't make formula with it. Don't wash lettuce." He texted nobody. He made a mental note to fill his kettle. That night, the city S text came through as he sat on the chair with his shoes off and felt as if the rug under his feet had been made of dried grass, not failed fabric. The number they used for announcements wrote, "Expected duration, undetermined." He put water on to boil like a citizen. The faucet ran with a slight clatter at first, like air learning how to not be air in a pipe. He watched the bubbles because they were trying. The pot made a sound like a story. He filled a bottle and wrote "drinking" on a piece of masking tape because he has learned not to trust himself to remember. In the bedroom, the nightstand had kept its promise. He turned off the light because he had to talk himself into being the man he likes to be at least once daily. He slept because the body decides without the head. He woke because the body also decides. The absence was back, that removing of a layer of sound, like a filter you hadn't known you were using, had been lifted and the air was too sharp. The doll sat with patience at the foot of the bed. The whisper came the second he let himself admit he was awake. Dry, small, not mouth, something leaf-like sliding on concrete in October. "Thank you for letting me out." He lay and felt the words in the places you feel thunder without having to hear it. In the soft between the jaw and ear, the little meat below the collarbone, the place under the ribs that is unscientific. He didn't say anything. The refrigerator hummed. Far off, a train. The blue crescent eye did what reflection is for. He turned on the light to set the room back into the ordinary, and she remained. No grin, no malicious tilt increased. He stood and put her on the nightstand. He turned her toward the wall. He stood longer than he needed to stand. When he lay back down, he took 3 counted breaths and felt foolish counting. The whisper did not return. If the story had ended there, he could have told it as a bad dream, from a week when the city S water turned into a chemistry set and the light at Hollow Pike S bottom hung on yellow like it had been given a cheaper spring. But days say so rarely when the end is their honor. On Thursday, he saw small things changed in the apartment when he had not changed them. The towel on the oven bar hung folded in a way he had not taught his hands. The mug he left for rinsing turned so the handle pointed left, and he never set a mug that way, because the thumb on his right hand knows the weight of the handle toward one direction better. The receipt he kept by the sink to remind him to drop a shift trade request at work had a corner turned down. He doesn't fold receipts, he tells himself, because they remember folds in the worst way. Under fluorescent at work, he felt a new wrong in the pitch. A ballast had gone and a replacement had come, and the tone had shifted a hair. He found himself hearing it like a person hears their own name in a room full of noise. Barcode beeps asked for different timing from his hand. He laughed at himself when he realized he was softer with the scanner than necessary, like a person who has a favorite stray cat outside his building and tries to show the world he can be gentle at the right pitch. The Boyle advisory extended. The text came in with out of and und lined up like a poem because of spacing the clerk hadn't respected when they wrote it. He boiled. He saved. He did not use the hose in the shared yard when the child downstairs asked to spray his dinosaur because the city had asked him for that small obedience and because the hose S smell would have made him feel he was pouring a coin roll into the air. At night, the doll sat at the foot of the bed, whether he had left her in the attic or on the nightstand or in the kitchen under a bowl. He took her up to the attic once with her yarn arranged as if she were being made ready for a photograph and wrapped in a towel the color of wrong lemons. He told himself rituals work and then punished himself for sounding like a child. The attic bulb buzzed like a hospital on a slow shift. The newspapers topped the trunk with their familiar dates. He set her there and pulled the ladder up and wanted the door to make a final sound when he slid it back into place. Wood made the low complaint the old make when asked to change position. On his way down the stairwell, the hallway light sensor failed for a second and then found him like a parent that had thought he had left. At 2, he woke and she sat again at the edge of his bed, like a person waiting for their turn. He didn't look for a camera angle. He didn't set flour on the floor to find prints. He had watched a show once where a man did that and found the footprints belonged to him. He did not want to be told everything that way. The whisper came because it had to. "Thank you for letting me out." He turned his face toward the shade. He put his thumb in the little slot where the draw cord had left a tacky place. He turned his head back and picked her up and set her on the nightstand. He did not turn her to face the wall. He looked at her chipped eye and for a stupid moment thought of bodies of water and what they saved for themselves. Everything he hadn't suffered yet came after, but in the small way life likes. He began to sleep in pieces. An hour smeared into day here and 3.5 hours through a night. Appetite went the way a real appetite does when it's asked to travel as baggage. Sweeter things tasted too slick. Salty turned into a penalty. Coffee those days had a watery middle. He began granting himself toasts because toast is nothing and everything. He placed lists beside lists as if a perpendicular arrangement of ink could hold a room together. He made a list of the things that didn't move when he left them and loved them too much. The jar of rice, the red hand broom, the bar of soap worn to a shape his thumb had domesticated. The city kept narrowing his choices by way of small jobs it had to do. The Boyle advisory dragged. A notice on the community center S door announced that the after-school program was relocated to the old library for the environmental hygiene upgrades, and he understood that to mean mold had become someone else's problem. The laundromat took one row of machines out of service to install new ones and needed the extension cords from the other, and the sidewalk had an extension of caution tape that flicked and clicked in the wind as if it had found itself a hobby. The distribution center posted a sign that the freight elevator was out pending a contractor S inspection of bolts in the cable assembly. Use caution in the stairwell, they wrote, because caution was free. Traffic patterns on Hollow Pike shifted for a week because a city crew had dug a ditch for something that seemed egolessly practical and then left it while men with clipboards argued nicely. He found himself padding his routes. If the light stuck again, take the next block. If the stairwell's light failed, wait and breathe twice. If he caught himself looking at the doll longer than his pulse allowed, go outside and sift the wind. When he thought of backstory, as if his trouble needed to be justified by a sad to explain it, he tried to do it gently. His wife was elsewhere now, in terms he chose himself to lessen feelings. He did not mention to himself the way she had left a ring in the dish by the door the last afternoon, and he had watched it for an hour before calling her to ask if she meant to forget it. His mother texted him holidays. His sister answered sideways, the sort of siblingship you can keep alive with a photograph of a mug. And the text got a new one. One mixtape on a cloud, one "Are you okay?" when sirens made the local channel. He had been the maintenance kid in grade school, the one who liked to know the vents and the basement where the boiler lived. He had sunned himself in the ping of the old pipes that told whether the men upstairs had turned the heat up. He remembered the last dog he had loved without drama, and then had not been allowed to love because his life did not have room for a dog anymore. His backstory had no monster to pardon this one with. One night, near the end of the week, the city kept apologizing. After the power blipped twice in his apartment and the refrigerator had made a sound like relief each time it returned, he opened the small freezer and the cold roared past his face like the first breath after a held sob, and the doll sat on the floor when he turned around, placed carefully on the tile as if someone had chosen not to let her fall. He didn't remember leaving her in the kitchen. He had left her on the nightstand that afternoon. He could make an argument for his hands forgetting. He could not make an argument for the way the towel on the oven now had a mark just to the right of dead center, a ring the size of his mug, and he had made his ring earlier on the counter and wiped it. He set the mug on top of the ring then and felt like he was solving nothing and teaching himself a superstition. He tried science because the mind that can't dominate will enlist. Science is only a way of speaking when you know you do not know. He set his phone up on a stack of cookbooks he didn't need and told it to watch. He made a little ritual so the watching would not feel like an act of disloyalty to the room. He said out loud, "I am going to the bathroom," because his voice sounded childish to him and he needed to hear it behave. He closed the door and stood in the dark and counted to 50, and then came out and checked the phone, and it had recorded a rectangle of his kitchen breathing, the refrigerator's soft whir, and if he let it become a narrative, the image of him moving into frame, crossing to the nightstand he had placed on the kitchen table for this purpose, lifting the doll, setting her on the floor, standing 3 breaths, lifting her again, making a sound he didn't like, and placing her by the nightstand, as if to prove he could return things to where they belonged. He scrubbed a hand over his face in that way men on television do when they intend to be the man who finds answers. In his life, it only left his skin red. He deleted the recording because once he had seen something he could not argue with, and the argument was with a person he had to find a way to be kind to. He closed the nightstand drawer, and the sound of the drawer convinced him that drawers are only training for the grave. He went to work, and the forklift ran out of battery, and he pushed it with Jules to that place near the outlet where men go to apologize to machines. The barcode beeps fit a pattern he had let fall 3 days ago. The job lived again as song. He washed a mug, and the cut in the lip of the mug bit him. The towel in the break room had that smell like the river behind the park after a long summer. S. Haven. He left a note for night cleaning. "Please leave light on in stairwell. Elevator out. Thank you." He signed his name and second-guessed it, and then did not cross it out because your signature is the one concession to yourself in a life of short forms. He felt the in-betweens in the building, spaces under stairs, the corner by the loading dock where the exhaust makes everything sweet and deadly, lean their way into his day. The breaking point came quietly because he is that kind of person, and the scenes in his life never used the music other people expected. He went to the basement of the duplex to use the laundry sink because the upstairs faucet had started a trickle he didn't forgive. The basement had a different temperature than upstairs, a density that took the words out of your throat and pressed them between pipes. He had a length of hose the landlord kept near the sink. The hose had the particular perfumed water smell he associated with public pools, and the names of summers he pretends have not mattered this much. He turned the tap, and the water came brown and then clear, and the hose twitched in his hand because life does that at the start. The exit sign over the door buzzed. The bulb in the bare socket blinked off and on and decided to live a little longer. The concrete by the sink had a stain that had made up its mind and did not leave no matter how much anyone had scrubbed in generations. He bent to pull the plug in the tub so the water would run faster, and when he straightened, the doll sat on the folded towels by the sink, looking with her painted fragment of blue toward the board door, like someone listening to a person at the threshold. She hadn't been there when he came in. He had left her upstairs. He believed he had left her upstairs because the version of himself who left her there would be the one who had a chance to sleep. The whisper came, as if the water had learned it. "Thank you for letting me out." The sound of hose water hitting galvanized steel makes that dry sizzle like cooking the letter S. He shut off the tap because the apartment upstairs had taught him how much of his life depends on listening to small noises and hearing the one that matters. The hose gave up its last. In the last trickle, he thought he saw the horrible little ladder of a movement, a bead running away from surface tension, and saw none of it dramatic, the yarn hair on the doll bow and lift and bow again as the exit buzz changed. He thought of the attic, the sweaters that had forgotten bodies. He thought of himself standing in this light with hose water on one hand and a basin ring on the other. He thought of how he would tell this to no one. He picked her up because picking up was the only motion that felt like him. He held her against his chest as if she weighed enough to be a thing he could throw, and his body insisted. He set her down. He could not become the man who carries things to destruction, not even porcelain. He apologized to a doll. He had to wait out the apology in the cold. Upstairs, the refrigerator hummed and then did not. He leaned on the counter with his hands on the cool laminate and stared at the mug he had washed earlier and debated its placement like it mattered. He did not need to be comforted by this, but it did comfort him. He had told himself since leaving his old life that if he could keep the ordinary, then he could get through anything. Now his ordinary was complicit. He did not know who to scold when a towel took an on purpose he had no given it. He lived like that for days more. The city lifted the advisory and then posted a new one because a rust-stained aerial shot of a pipe, released in a memo they hadn't meant to make public, became the picture in old people's texts to their grandchildren. The distribution center got its elevator back, and the stairwell S-light returned to the kind you forget to thank. The traffic light at Hollow Pike found its timing again. The men on the road finished the ditch and packed dirt in, and the ground swallowed the water and went on pretending it is immortal. Leaks were reported and repaired, and then other leaks took their turn. He took things out of his apartment and returned them so he would feel like a person who still had their hands. He set the doll in the sink and turned the tap and felt the urge to test what water does to glaze and stopped, ashamed. He left her on the landing and went down for the mail because the stairwell light was good there and the angles made her look merely static. When he returned with a flyer about a neighborhood lot clearance and a past due notice from when a clerk misread his name, she sat at the top of the stairs again like a child who does not trust the lower steps. He moved her to the window. He moved her out of the window when a neighbor made a shape with his face that suggested he had joined a story Evan wasn't telling. He began to hear other sentences in the house, not words, but the grammar of use. The neighbor S washing machine up and over the landing has a spin cycle with 2 thumps before the velocity that signals we're serious. The child downstairs drags a toy car along a baseboard as if trying to find the seam the house hides. A couple in the next building argue by not speaking, and the lack of their television on Tuesday night was a conversation he wished they didn't have to have. He slept better when the distribution center changed the shift by half an hour, for reasons no one understood, because a bureaucrat S software had decided efficiency lived there. Half an hour matters when you are learning the tune of a life. It is perhaps perverse that the thing that broke him did not get into a posture at all. He came home one morning after a shift in which the manager had made everyone stand by the time clock with too many words about safety and incident reports, as if this were a family and we had to do better as a family. He turned the lock. The refrigerator hummed. The bead of water at the end of the tap shifted temperature in the way metal tells itself news. He walked into the bedroom and saw nothing out of place, and in the corner of the room by the hamper where he never puts anything because he has taught himself not to let laundry become geography. She lay on her side with her lace pressing a pattern into the wood. He didn't pick her up. He sat on the edge of the bed because a person must become their own barrier, and he was the barrier between her and the wall where he would want to put his head in an hour. He sat. He heard the whisper. Not because it came, but because it had to. And that was when he noticed the half rings around the legs of the nightstand. Water had made them when he had put glasses down without a coaster, not an accusation in any country but this one. And they were now half again to the right, as if the nightstand had inched and he had not heard it. He stood up and stood and felt his breath find him again, only at the kitchen sink when the tap coughed. The whisper had the rhythm of his name if he let it. "Thank you for letting me out." He turned off the water, and the single drop at the end did that tiny miracle of holding on to itself until a second drop joined and overcame surface tension and fell. He put his finger quickly to catch the next, and it broke on his skin and left a ring there when it dried. He went to the counselor at the clinic without forethought because the clinic had a sign that said "walk in," and he could not resist a word that sounded like what his feet were doing. She sat with him and did not let her eyebrows speak. He told her in sentences that embarrassed him about the doll, about the nightstand, about the whisper. He told her about towels and the rings on a counter and being a man whose pride had begun to rest on the hum of a refrigerator. He said, "I don't think I'm sick." And she said, "You don't need to be sick to be tired." She told him about a thing an article had said about the brain, how readiness sometimes comes before notes, and that the body moves before the mind writes its report. She said, "That's not a diagnosis." She said, "You sleep in pieces. We can make you a plan." She said, "Buy the grocery store napkins. They do in a pinch." She said, "If there is an object and it moves, you can build a life around the idea that your hands are moving it or that the air is moving it. Which life feels kinder?" He said, "I am tired of being kind." He tried being unkind. He put her in a trash bag and put the bag on the porch and sat in the living room without the bag there, and the bag made its own weather behind the door because plastic speaks when wind asks, and he sat and understood that the bag could catch water and then smell, and then Mrs. Kemper would name him in her mind as a man who leaves his life on porches. He brought her inside not because of kindness to her but because of a porches policy. He set her in the sink and turned the tap on lightly and watched water sheet over unborn eyes, and then saw his reflection in that water and felt a new disgust he didn't know where to place at the world for making this scene familiar. He stopped performing tests. He bought a heavy mug with a straight side that would make rings honest. He put the mug down on the towel. He did not wipe the ring. He slept in the living room with his back against his couch and his knees fallen out in an unflattering geography. Waking passed like a wet cat through him. He heard the refrigerator. He heard a siren. He heard the whisper and felt nothing but the movement of air in a room he could name the edges of. When he got to work, the scanner beeped loudly as if the machine had been taught by someone angry. He taped a note back on the manager S desk because the tape had curled, and last night S note had lifted. Stairwell light. Please leave on. Thank you. He took a receipt from a woman who needed to return a box of mugs because one had arrived with a crack, and everyone involved decided that meant all mugs had a crack. He traded a shift with Jules and then regretted it because his mind had made up its schedule and now his body was a half beat behind. The distribution center's elevator thunked sweetly into place. He blessed the engineer who had convinced it to find itself again. The forklift S battery went to full and turned itself off with a sound like a door made right. A cousin texted him a photograph of their grandfather S tobacco tin and asked if he wanted it, and he answered no, because taking someone else's memory into a house with a porcelain face seemed like daring the heir to adopt a taste for cruelty. Mrs. Kemper asked him if his sink had started doing that cough because a neighbor had reported a cough and she didn't want to pay a plumber to fix what wasn't plumbing, she said, and he laughed and gave her his respect and said he would turn the valve and see. He could change valves and not a life, He closed his eyes in the basement with the hose and turned the little quarter turn on the line and thought of blood and did not faint. That week the lights misbehaved twice more, and the traffic light at Hollow Pike apologized by going red on an empty street when the squad car came past without its siren on and pretended to be a normal car. He sat on the bed one afternoon and looked at the doll and said, "Are you anything but me?" And it felt like a question terrible to ask, because the heir does not need to be implicated in our games. He emptied the dish by the door and replaced it with the chipped bowl he kept under the sink, and it made a different sound when he set his key down, and he approved of it. He moved the nightstand to the other side of the bed, and it left a shockingly clean rectangle behind, as if it had slept with a hand over its face. He slept that night without waking. He woke, and she sat at the foot of the bed in the geometry that no longer made sense, and he could not be angry, and he could not be glad. At the end of his time with the doll, as if a time can have an end when you still live in the place where it lived, he stood in the kitchen waiting for the water to boil to a safe point for the city, and he thought of the phrase, "Thank you." He thought of all the times he had said it at work when people had handed him money for carrying a box, and how it had felt theatrical sometimes, and how the better moments were when he had said it to the sound a machine made when it gathered its courage, and how once he had said it to the traffic light because it had chosen him and let him through. He thought of the way the whisper had said it, as if time had been locked and a thing in it had begun to move again and wanted acknowledgement without praise. The last night he dreamed she had arms, and they weighed nothing and were heavy. He woke and put his hand on the nightstand and felt wood and rings and dryness. He looked and she sat. He did the motion he knows, lifted, turned, placed. He lay down and let the refrigerator talk him into his breath. He lay there knowing that in some small room in him, a door had been opened, whether by him or for him or by no one at all. And what had come out was not a monster a movie could use, but a sensitivity the world does not pay you extra to have. He lay there and let it walk the apartment like it owned him, which it does. And he thought of hose water and towels and the metal taste under the sink and traffic lights that sometimes forget themselves, and the hard, honest yellow of old painted eyes. And he spoke the sentence because someone needed to. "Thank you for letting me out." He kept the doll after that because he could not imagine subjecting a thrift store to the idea of a man placing a wrapped figure on a counter and paying. He did not try to make her exhibit. He did not fear her when the light caught her chin and made it a different shape. He understood that if he had wanted a house that made no noises, he would have rented in a different part of town, somewhere glib with new drywall and spite. He understood, too, that whatever had learned how to leave a place in him would keep finding its way into rooms until he taught it which corners were his. He bought 2 new towels on a Saturday and folded them like his mother liked, if only to feel the old motions move through his hands. He learned to go to sleep with the light off, because a person who has been brave for too long deserves the small reward of darkness being a neutral thing again. The refrigerator hummed. The traffic light kept its word. The scanner at work did its beep with the same lack of self-consciousness. When the city sent no messages for a week, he missed them, which felt broken until he understood he had become used to being managed. When a child cried over a broken toy in the aisle, he picked it up and found the wheel and said nothing. And when the child shook it without thanks, he smiled in the way that tells a person you forgive, even if they can T-shape the word yet. When the delivery on Friday came crushed and his manager asked him to take a picture and send it, he took the picture and then set the phone face down on the table and stared at the ring his mug had made and let it dry there for once. In the afternoon he went home and the apartment smelled like heat that had taken responsibility. The doll sat on the nightstand facing the wall. He walked past and touched her shoulder with his 2 fingers, light as breathing, not because she had taught him manners, but because he had remembered them. and that was the quietest mercy the week had offered him.